Fishy Cup was a great indication as to what we could expect from competitive moving forward in Fortnite Chapter 2 Season 1. We got to see some of the best EU players play it out, and I learned a lot. So without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss our lessons learned from the Fishy Cup. And first, I want to touch on the lack of mobility because this does have an effect. You go back to Season 10, you had hoverboards, you had launch pads, you had grapplers, right? You had a lot of mobility to be not only able to disengage, but also to travel very quickly to the next zone. Now, in early and mid game, this is where you're going to see a lot of the huge impacts being made, at least from the limited mobility in terms of moving across the map, right? And we kind of saw that in the Fishy Cup. And one of the things that I kind of noticed is early on, players would go ahead and go to their natural landing spot, but they wouldn't really think about rotating early. And the problem that persists with this is a lot of players would get into engagements that they necessarily didn't have to get involved with, right? And this is because of one of two things. First and foremost, they're so used to being able to traverse across the map so quickly that they kind of loot a little bit longer than they should be, or they get into early fights that they shouldn't get involved with. And because of this, they find themselves battling the storm to try and get to the new safe zone. And we saw that, a little bit, at least with, maybe I would say probably about 10 or so squads, and it did get at least allow for a couple of eliminations earlier on. And the second thing that we saw is players would get into engagements when they shouldn't be engaging. For example, let's say there was, you have to move into the next safe zone. There's a squad in front of you, and a player would just, while they're behind them, just take a snipe shot at them, right? And it just wasn't necessary to do. And what is this all boiled down to? Well, it boils down to a fight, and that fight can exist and last until the storm basically engulfs them. Then before you know it, you're having to battle this team out inside storm, and it doesn't put yourself in a good position whatsoever. So I think old habits die hard, right? When before you could disengage very quickly and you could just W key as much as you wanted to, now you can't really do that. And we saw kind of an impact from that, at least in the Fishy Cup, earlier in early game and mid game. But in late game, I was kind of curious from this mobility. How quickly could these players traverse the ground? How quickly could we see a couple of these players go into half and half? For example, maybe they were low ground or high ground. And also, how dangerous could it be? Well, I kind of watched Metro, CRR, as well as Kenzo and Falconly. And I had to say they had to rotate into half and half, and they were on low ground, and they found a very genius strategy by just rotating onto the outside of the safe zone, or at least right onto the edge of circle. They were able to use that to their advantage. Nobody's going to be paying attention to zone, right onto the outside of zone. Everybody's thinking, nobody's going to be behind me. They used that to their advantage, and they were able to rotate into half and half in just about 30 to 40 seconds. It's very quick. And in fact, it was cheap as well. You would think they would have to burn through a lot of mats. In fact, it only cost them about 100 mats, and they only used those 100 mats to set up a little base whenever they got inside the safe zone. So that limited mobility people were worried about, maybe even including myself, didn't have much of an impact on late game, but early and mid game, 100% had an impact. And another thing mobility-wise that I think had a huge impact was lateral mobility. Now, this includes shockwave grenades, launch pads, bouncers being removed from the game. Players were so used to using this cheap form of inventory to take over high ground and reset. Well, with that being gone, a battle for high ground was 100% real, and it forced players in the roles. Were they happy with playing the low ground warrior? And maybe that's their play style, or because they were forced to do so, only because they didn't have the mats to overtake the high ground. Or could they take over ultimate high ground and be satisfied with staying up there? And because if you have that, well, I mean, really, there's no one who's going to be able to knock you down. And with the lack of lateral mobility, I was a little bit worried, at least competitively, that whoever had high ground, they weren't coming down, and it was going to be virtually impossible to overtake that from a solid squad. But it wasn't until I think it was like game 2 or game 3, we saw a massive battle for high ground. And this was between Mongrel squad as well as Metro squad. And Metro ended up cranking all the way to the top to take over Mongrel's high ground, destroyed his squad along with Mongrel himself. And he had high ground all for himself and his squad, right? This was able to be retook with just limited amount of mats and just a couple of brain cells, and it was awesome to see. And I gotta say, the lateral mobility being removed actually ended up being a great thing to see because it forced players and forced squads to play a lot smarter and more intelligently, and it added more of a competitive feel. So definitely very warranted to say the least. Now, something else that I want to move on to is the topic of splodes. We've all seen it. Splodes are rampant, and I gotta say they need a rework. But if you were to look at any of the inventories throughout the tournament, the Fishy Cup, you would notice players would have at least 10 to 20 to 30 splodes, and that includes nades and a mixture of RPGs in their inventory. And that's just because they're way too powerful. And the biggest impact of splodes were, in fact, nades. And that's because you could stack 10 of them. You could throw them virtually without any time in between throws. RPGs, you still need to reload, right? It can take some time. But you can just, continue to spam them out. And if you do it wisely, it can result in basically a knock or an elimination fully, pretty much right off the rip. It's almost a free kill, if you will, or a free knock. And nades were rampant throughout the Fishy Cup, more so than any other season before. And it was quite surprising to see, but the usefulness of nades and RPGs go without saying, right? I mean, they're incredibly powerful. They can force, they can destroy builds, get a knock, get a kill. They can also force rotations out from your players, especially in late games. So, I mean, it's surprising, but it shows us that nades right now are too prevalent, and they definitely need a rework, but more on that later. Something subtle but very crucial that I noticed that every squad implemented was the idea of fishing. Fishing became very important. And I thought it was going to be a novelty at first, but no, it's a very real thing, right? Fishing is something every squad should be doing, at least having one person go out there and try to catch your floppers, right? Try to catch your slurpfish, because a flopper is 50 health in just 1 second. A slurpfish is 50 shield in just 1 second. You can't get those that usability anywhere else throughout the hills and shields, right? You look at minis, you look at half pots, you look at bandages, med kits, right? They all take at least 3 seconds all the way up to 10 seconds to use. If you're talking about a flopper or a slurpfish, you're getting 50 heals or 50 shields in just the span of 1 second. You have to have someone stacking these fish, especially for late game when you don't have the luxury of sitting there to take a mini, right? To take a half pot. You know how quick and violent the Turtle Wars can be and how violent the end game can be. You don't have seconds to spare. So having those fish in your inventory became a critical thing amongst these squads in the Fishy Cup. Overall, though, putting everything together, I got to say, I was pretty surprised how lateral movement really didn't play too much of effect over taking high ground. I saw less retakes overall, but I enjoyed it more as a spectator. And I know as for at least the competitive players, they really got to showcase their overall skills building wise, right? Cranking those 90s in playground really kind of got to really showcase their skills, especially during the Fishy Cup, because there was no way to quickly overtake high ground. It was just basically built on your knowledge and your overall abilities to be able to build. So it was great seeing that overall. I got to say, Splodes definitely need a rework, as I mentioned earlier. RPGs, first and foremost, they can take up 2 inventory slots, therefore kind of making you think, is it really worth it getting rid of 1 inventory slot where I can have hills and shields to just carry an RPG? Or maybe RPGs being reduced in ammo. And the same thing goes for nades. I think nades, stacking it at 10 is just a little bit too much. Maybe reduce it to 6, 5, maybe even 4 to go ahead and make these players think, is it worth it carrying nades? And if I do have nades, I can't just spam them at my enemy's builds. And because of that, I'm really going to have to think about how I'm going to utilize them and utilize them with my team more effectively. And even honestly, a nerf to the overall damage for a nade could be hugely beneficial overall. And still, in terms of lateral movement, going back to that, I would like to see bouncers added, because I do want to see at least some versatility in players being able to overtake high ground versus just having to burn through mats and build. Overall, FNCS squads is going to be underway very shortly in the next coming weeks. I'm excited to see if this competitiveness we saw in the Fishy Cup, is it going to be implemented, and what else are we going to learn that is going to change throughout Chapter 2, Season 1.